The Dragonflight beta was down for a few hours today and I needed a way to kill time. I've been wanting to do this type of video for actually quite some time now and I've just been honestly pushing it off. Ever since we've gotten a new talent tree rework, there has been a burning question in the back of my mind. Which tank has the most utility? Well, today we're going to have a little bit of fun trying to solve this question. For the record, I want to make this extremely clear. This in no way, shape, or form determines which tank will be quote unquote best. It's just an interesting topic of conversation to see which tank has the most utility and the most useful utility. Honestly, I'm curious and eager to compare, so let's go. First things first, let's get an Excel sheet going so I can actually see all my information in one spot. Don't worry, I'll attempt to fix the formatting later. At first I was thinking I would just list out all the abilities that I would consider to be utility, tally them up, and present a score, but that's too easy and slightly problematic. The first problem that I ran into was trying to decide what would be considered a utility spell, and will probably be the core issue of this video. What I may define as utility might not be what you, the viewer at home, would consider utility. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to try to settle on this loose definition. An ability or passive buff that can either provide a benefit to your group or allies to counter certain mechanics, or a way to control or counter enemies. I think this covers most of the bases. Things like kicks, displacements, CC, dispels, group cooldowns, and or external should all fall under this umbrella. As I progress through each of the class tree, I will end up adding abilities that may stray away from this definition slightly, but I will try to explain my reasoning why to include or exclude certain abilities. To start, I wanted to log onto my Brewmaster. I just figured this would be the best place to start. Originally, I wanted to categorize utility based on whether it's considered baseline or a talent choice, but I quickly threw that idea out the window because, well, the new talents actually provide most of our utility, and it's possible to not play certain talents at all. Not that this would ever be the case, but in the case of the Brewmaster, you could literally not take Disable, Detox, or Spearhand Strike. So I need to figure out a workaround for this. I honestly started going down the rabbit hole, and in order to prevent myself from spiraling, I decided to actually just back it up a bit and stick to the basics. Let's get everything listed that is considered utility under our definition, and then we can trim around the edges later. So I began adding all of the abilities to an Excel sheet, from Tiger's Lust, Paralysis, Detox, Disable, Lake Sweep, Ring of Peace, etc. I really tried to take a fine-tooth comb through each of the trees and the spellbooks, but please let me know if I ended up missing anything. Oh, and there are certain abilities I don't add, like Spell Block, for example, for the Warrior, under the notion that I would consider this a defensive more than a utility talent choice. After a short 4,737 seconds, we have finally reached a point on the sheet where I felt that I've added everything that I would consider to be utility, but it was formatted poorly and I honestly completely unorganized. Over the next few hours, I spent a bit of time cleaning it up. I'm not going to walk through everything, but I was able to categorize all of the spells. The colored boxes indicate whether an ability is baseline, a likely or unlikely talent choice, and I also tried to include an optional talent choice because there are certain talent options that are easy to pick up but are generally played around unless needed. Lastly, for categories, I landed on the following. We have things like group buffs for abilities like Battle Shout, Mystic Touch, Mark of the Wild, etc. We also have kicks and silences, which also include short spell immunities like Spell Reflect and AMS. We also have combat res, and I also added non-combat res, but I'll talk about this stuff later. We have friendly dispels alongside purges and enemy dispels, slows and roots, single mob CC, AoE CC, displacement spells, group defensive, slow and root removals, friendly externals, death protection, which would also be considered a cheat death, or health-based defenses. And then I also want to include things like odd utility like Spectral Sight and Path of Frost. This will typically be the category where if no other tank really has it, I kind of threw it into this section. And then lastly, I wanted to add a section for out of combat healing. Out of combat healing, I personally think is an important form of utility because there are certain mythic plus affixes like Grievous, or let's just say your healer is dead and a group member of yours has a few remaining seconds on a debuff. This might be a point where you want to actually heal. Also, there is nothing preventing you from casting these spells while out of combat, but those instances are far and few in between. Before I get into the analysis of which tank ends up having the most utility, I do want to mention that there were a few slight overlaps. For example, I am well aware that Tiger's Lust and Freedom could technically be considered something like a movement CD or even a dispel. I personally decided to leave the group movement abilities out and place things like Stampeding Roar in odd utility category. Now with everything neatly organized in 2 hours of my life that I'm never going to get back, let's break this down. I can't stress this enough. It's really hard to pit these tanks and their kit up against one another. There are instances where the displacement of Death Grip, for example, is incredibly useful, and there's times where it's practically useless. It's probably not the best example since it doubles as a taunt. Okay, maybe something like Control Undead is a better example. Yeah. Control Dead might be crazy good in a place like Shadowmoon Burial Ground, but useless in Halls of Valor or Ruby Life Pools. That's the beauty of these talent trees, though. We don't need to talent into Ursol's Vortex or Intervene or Clash in every single instance. A good tree has good flexibility, so basically the point I'm trying to make is that regardless of how I score this, each class easily provides a ton of utility, and how great that utility is based on a ton of different conditions, like the form of content you're doing, the composition, just your general preference, and etc. Anyways, I'm just really trying to cover my ass here. I think at face value, I can just add up all of these utility spells and present for each class and call it a day. But honestly, that won't really work because there are some spells that are useless in some scenarios more than not. There are also talent options that provide one of two utility spells, especially for Druid, that compete with each other. So I'll tell you what, let's add up how many options there are, and then we'll subtract the spells that I would consider like relatively useless, or that compete against each other, or are just in general extremely niche. Surprisingly, the scores seem to come out though quite even when taken at face value. If you asked me before which tank would have the most optional utility, off the top of my head I would probably list Paladin or Druid. They have always had a pretty expansive kit, and their scores, to reflect that, were both 21s. The rest of the tanks, including Death Knight, Vengeance, Brewmaster, and Protection Warrior, all had exactly 15 points, which is actually surprising. I thought that would differ a little bit more. Though the reality is that not all tanks have the same amount of options. Let's quickly subtract the niche abilities, unlikely talent choices, and out-of-combat spells. Starting with the Death Knight, I removed Control Undead. I thought about removing Path of Frost, but it's in the base kit, so I figured I would just leave it. This knocks DK down only 1 point, leaving it at 14. Again, it's easy to argue that Path of Frost isn't useful, or that Gorfien's Grasp might not be taken anymore, or whatever may have you, but this is my list, and I'm gonna do what I want. So, for the Vengeance Demon Hunter, their Vengeful Bonds talent will probably almost never be taken in Mythic Plus, so I removed a point for that, and then the ability Darkness also doesn't really scale well in Mythic Plus, so I removed a point for that as well. This puts DH at 13 points. The Druid suffers the most from this format. By taking away out-of-combat utility like Res, Healing, Shifting Forms, alongside of a bunch of competitive talent nodes, they are knocked all the way down to 11. For the record, I included After the Wildfire in the original list because of the healing potential it has, especially in raids, and for the same reason I had Convoke in this list, but that's almost probably never going to happen, and there's notes in the Excel document. So because of that, I'm just going to subtract these as well. For the Warrior, I kept it simple. I removed Berserker Shout for the group fear removal and Spear of Bastion, since that will almost never be the play, especially since the class has so many outstanding nodes like Avatar, Thunderous Roar, and Shockwave. This will put the Warrior at 13 points, rivaling the VDH. Monk also loses a lot here. Most likely, you won't be playing into all the different group buffs, especially like Windwalking. Similar to Druids, I also took away out-of-combat spells like Vivify. Also, Disable and Clash are unlikely to be taken in most scenarios. Disable is honestly more of a PvP talent, and even if you do need a slow, there are other classes in your group comp that will more than likely provide a better, less costly version. This knocks Monk down to just 10 points. Now for Paladin. This class has easily the most options and will be difficult to beat. I ended up actually taking out Concentration Aura and Crusader Aura. You can always Aura Dance, but that would only occur in low-level content, and of course if you had a Holy Paladin in the group who wanted your Diva Aura instead of you. Also, Repentance and Blinding Light are on a node together, so we're going to lose a point there. Spell Warding and Bop share a CD, and then the last point removal will come from the out-of-combat heal, leaving Paladin at just 16 points. But we do have our winner now. The Protection Paladin, and honestly, it's not really a surprise. I do want to mention that this doesn't, again, mean anything. For example, Monk only being at 10 points still brings some of the strongest utility in Mythic Plus, from Leg Sweep to Paralysis to Ring of Peace. Also, like things like Intervene from a Warrior, like a new Warrior player, a noob in this case, it'd be practically useless on. Also, like things like Sigil of Misery and Intimidating Shout have no use against undead mobs, so in Shadowmoon Burial Grounds they would lose points. The point is, utility can be relatively subjective and needs to be viewed with the content you are talking about in mind. I could and would love to sit here all day to try to figure out the best tank for each specific scenario in Raid and Mythic Plus, but beta is about to be back up, so I'm gonna go. Let me know what you guys think down below. Was this a fair analysis of tank utility, or did I miss any spells that should be in the list? Also, what should I order for Taco Bell tonight? Just so many questions. Anywho, that's my time. Huge shout out to all my patrons who give their actual dollars and dimes so I can make, well, whatever you want to call this. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.